In the year 1209 BC, an Egyptian scribe stood before this towering slab of black granite. He brought a chisel down onto the stone and
Right, he was carving a victory poem, basically a massive PR statement for his pharaoh.
exactly, just this huge list of, conquered enemies and destroyed cities. But when he got to one specific enemy, down near the very bottom of the monument, he made this tiny, almost invisible grammatical choice.
He swapped out one silent symbol for another, which is just, well, it's wild to think about.
It is, because he couldn't possibly have known that this single, soundless chisel mark would sit buried in the desert sand for like over 3 millennia, only to be dug up and become the explosive center of one of the most fiercely debated timelines in human history.
It's staggering, honestly, because, we spend so much time looking at ancient history from 30,000 feet.
Right, the macro stuff, wars, empires falling, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. But so often, the real definitive proof, the stuff we spend centuries searching for it, comes down to the micro, like a shattered piece of pottery,
Right.
or a layer of ash, or in this case, the specific structural mechanics of a dead language carved into a rock.
That is the beautiful, frustrating reality of archaeology, and it is exactly what we are plunging into today on this deep dive.
It's a massive topic.
Oh, totally. We are taking on a really ambitious mission here. We are going to explore the intersection of the biblical narrative, specifically that epic arc from Joseph down in Egypt through to Moses and the Exodus, and we are going to cross-reference it with the hard physical evidence of Egyptian archaeology.
Putting the texts and the dirt on the same table.
Precisely. We have a highly detailed historical text to guide us, alongside 3 very specific visual anchors. We've got a limestone mural of an ancient migration, a terrifyingly colossal pharaoh statue, and of course that massive black granite slab from 1209 BC. We want to see where the stories and the stones actually collide. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Well, to do that, you have to strip away a lot of preconceived notions first.
Yeah.
Like what? I mean, when you try to visualize the Israelites in Egypt, your brain is probably heavily polluted by pop culture. We all picture native Egyptian pharaohs on golden thrones, right? Ruling over this unchanging society for thousands of years.
Right, and the Israelites just arriving into this super hostile, xenophobic environment. That's the classic Sunday school image.
Exactly. But the geopolitical reality on the ground back then was wildly different. It was fluid and, frankly, way more chaotic.
So, to understand how the Great Escape of the Exodus happened, we really have to rewind and figure out how they got to Egypt in the first place, which takes us out of that traditional pharaoh image entirely.
It does.
Because if you look at the first piece of visual evidence we have, it's this painted scene on a limestone wall, an ancient mural, and it doesn't look anything like the crisp, white linen world of classic Egypt.
No, not at all. You are looking at a snapshot from what historians call the Second Intermediate Period, so roughly 1750 to 1550 BC. And the reason it looks so different is that the people in the procession aren't Egyptian.
They stand out immediately. I mean, the clothing is the first thing that catches your eye. Instead of those sheer, simple white kilts, these people are wearing these incredibly vibrant knee-length tunics.
Heavy woven garments, right? With
Wow.
complex geometric patterns.
Yeah, red and blue vertical stripes, interlocking squares. Plus, they have thicker hair, the men have prominent beards, and they're driving livestock, like bringing donkeys loaded with goods and children. It looks exactly like a full-scale migration.
Because that is exactly what it is. It's capturing a massive demographic shift. These are Asiatic, specifically Semitic groups migrating from the Canaan region.
So that's modern-day Israel, Lebanon, parts of Syria, right?
Exactly. They are moving southwest, crossing the Sinai Peninsula, and pouring into the eastern edge of the Nile Delta, a region historically called Goshen.
But, why the sudden influx? Was it a military invasion? Because honestly, the mural makes it look more like a caravan of refugees or merchants.
It was mostly driven by environmental and economic factors.
Right.
Canaan relied entirely on seasonal rainfall, so it was super susceptible to drought and famine.
Ah, okay.
But Egypt was the breadbasket of the ancient world. The Nile River had this predictable annual flood that guaranteed massive crop yields. So when famine hit the Levant, people naturally migrated to the food security of the Delta.
That makes total sense.
Yeah, and over decades, this wasn't just a trickle of traders. It became a massive, sustained settlement of Semitic people in Goshen.
So they settle there, they assimilate quietly, and just become like a lower-class labor force for the mighty Egyptian empire.
That's what you'd assume, but the reality is way more dramatic. The Egyptian central government at this time was severely weakened. They were having all these dynastic struggles down south.
So they were distracted.
Exactly. So the Semitic immigrants in the north didn't just assimilate. They accumulated wealth, they set up trade monopolies with Canaan, and they eventually leveraged that economic power into absolute political dominance.
Wow.
Yeah, they grew so powerful they basically initiated a coup. They took over northern Egypt, built their own capital city called Avaris, and literally crowned themselves pharaohs.
I have to pause you there, because the text translates the Egyptian name for these rulers as the Hyksos, which means rulers of foreign lands. Are you telling me that for a couple hundred years, the actual pharaohs of Egypt were immigrants from Canaan?
Completely.
Yeah.
The Hyksos were a Semitic ruling class governing over an Egyptian populace.
That is wild.
Right. I mean, they adopted Egyptian royal titles, built temples, all of that, but ethnically and culturally, they were Asiatic.
See, this completely upends how I've always viewed the biblical story of Joseph. You know the narrative, Joseph is a young Hebrew boy sold into slavery by his brothers. He ends up in Egypt, gets thrown in prison, but eventually interprets a dream for the pharaoh about an impending famine.
The famous 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine.
Exactly. And then suddenly, this pharaoh elevates this foreign slave to be the vizier, like the prime minister of the whole Egyptian state. Historically, I always thought that felt like a massive stretch.
You're not alone.
Yeah.
Critics have pointed that out for over a century. The argument was always, native Egyptians were notoriously xenophobic. They considered outsiders to be unclean.
Right.
So there's zero historical precedent for a native Egyptian pharaoh elevating a Hebrew slave to the second highest office. Just wouldn't happen.
But if we place Joseph's rise during the second intermediate period, during the reign of the Hyksos, it's a totally different ballgame.
Exactly.
It makes me think of a modern corporate takeover. Like, imagine you work at this massive legacy corporation that is deeply set in its ways. Suddenly, the company gets bought out by a new ownership group from your specific tiny hometown.
I love this analogy.
Right. The new CEO doesn't trust the old executive board because they resent his takeover, but he looks at you, a low-level employee who shares his exact background, his language, his cultural touchstones. Suddenly, your chances of getting promoted to VP skyrocket.
It's spot on. Joseph wasn't an outsider to the rulers of Egypt. He was their cultural cousin. The Hyksos pharaohs were surrounded by this resentful native Egyptian populace. They needed administrators they could trust.
People who weren't loyal to the old southern dynasties.
Exactly. Elevating a brilliant Semitic foreigner like Joseph wasn't a miraculous fairy tale-defying logic. It was a highly strategic, totally plausible geopolitical move.
And that completely explains the rest of the narrative. When the famine hits Canaan, Joseph's family migrates down to Egypt to survive. He settles them in Goshen.
Yep.
They aren't begging for scraps from a hostile empire. They're moving into a thriving expat community run by their own ethnic peers, with their own brother acting as prime minister. It shifts the whole thing from a morality play to like a masterclass in ancient sociology.
It really does. It shows how a small tribal family could multiply into a massive population without being crushed by the host nation. The Hyksos umbrella provided the security for the Israelites to flourish.
But the golden age of the corporate buyout never lasts. The old guard always regroups. If the Hyksos were ruling in the north, what were the native Egyptians doing down south, just biding their time?
Boiling with resentment, mostly. The native princes were pushed south to Thebes. For generations, they viewed the Hyksos occupation as this humiliating trauma.
Their sacred land defiled by foreigners.
Exactly. And eventually, around 1550 BC, a Theban leader named Samos II launched a massive, brutal
The
rebellion.
War of Independence.
A total war of reconquest. Ios modernized the Egyptian military, ironically using the chariots and bows the Hyksos had introduced, and drove the foreign ruling class out of the delta. He chased them all the way back into Canaan.
Wow.
And that violent reconquest marks the beginning of the New Kingdom, the legendary 18th dynasty. The native Egyptians finally had their country back.
Which brings us to the second visual source in our deep dive today. If you walk through the ruins of New Kingdom temples, you are immediately confronted by these colossal, intimidating statues of native pharaohs.
They're massive.
The one in our source material is carved from solid stone, towering dozens of feet in the air. The pharaoh has his arms crossed, holding the crook and flail. The sheer scale. It doesn't project benevolence,
Yeah.
It projects an immovable, crushing weight. It feels like a threat.
Because architecture is always a reflection of national psychology. After the trauma of the occupation, the New Kingdom pharaohs became hyper-militaristic. They wanted to project absolute invincibility.
So no one would ever dare challenge them again.
Right. The era of open borders and welcoming Asiatic immigrants was violently slammed shut.
Our historical text points to a really famous line from the book of Exodus here. Exodus 1:8 says, "There rose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph."
A very loaded phrase.
For the longest time, I read that as literal amnesia. Like, how could they forget the guy who saved the country from a famine? But looking at the timeline of almost the first, not knowing Joseph is a political purge.
It is a deliberate act of state-sponsored erasure. The Romans later called it damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. The new pharaohs viewed everything from the Hyksos era as illegitimate, treasonous even.
So the old treaties, the land grants, all dead.
Exactly. To not know Joseph was a public declaration that the old deals were null and void.
But that creates a massive domestic crisis. Ahmose chased the Hyksos leadership out, but he didn't deport the entire Asiatic population. You still have this massive group of Semitic people, including the Israelites, living in Goshen, right on the eastern border.
And put yourself in the war room of a new kingdom pharaoh. You just shed blood to reclaim your nation from foreign invaders from the east.
Right?
And you look at a map, and your most vulnerable eastern flank is heavily populated by people who share the exact same ethnicity and language as the overlords you just overthrew.
That is the ultimate geopolitical nightmare. So the enslavement of the Israelites wasn't just random cartoonish villainy. It wasn't just a pharaoh waking up and deciding to be evil.
Not at all.
It was driven by intense state paranoia, the fear of a fifth column.
The biblical text actually quotes the pharaoh's rationale perfectly. It says, "Look, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or if war breaks out, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country."
That is a cold, calculated assessment of national security.
It really is. Ancient statecraft dictates that you can't just exterminate an entire labor force, because that ruins your economy. But you can't let them roam free either.
So the solution is state-sponsored, brutal forced labor.
Enslavement achieves multiple imperial goals at once. First, it extracts immense economic value. They needed an expendable workforce to make mud bricks for all these new temples. Second, it's a tool of physical and psychological suppression.
You exhaust the population.
Exactly. A man worked to the bone for 13 hours a day under a whip does not have the energy to mount an armed rebellion.
The mechanics of oppression functioning exactly as designed. It's chilling because it is so logical from an imperial perspective.
It really is.
Okay, so we have the setup. We've aligned the sociology of the Hyksos with Joseph and the paranoia of the new kingdom with the enslavement. The dominoes have fallen. But this brings us to the most fiercely debated, hair-pulling question in biblical archaeology.
Well, there we go.
We know why they were enslaved, but when exactly did they break free? When did the Exodus actually happen? We have to explain this dating debate because it is wild.
Welcome to the battlefield. If you get 10 archaeologists in a room to debate the date of the Exodus, you will get 12 screaming arguments.
And it basically fractures into two main camps, right? Separated by about 200 years.
Yep. Because depending on which set of historical clues you prioritize, you land on two totally different conclusions.
Okay, we need to lay out the math and the geography on this meticulously. Let's start with the first major theory, the 15th century early date. This theory relies heavily on a specific mathematical formula in the Hebrew Bible. 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1.
Right. The author of 1 Kings gives a very rigid chronological marker. It states the Exodus occurred exactly 480 years before the 4th year of King Solomon's reign, which was when he started building the first temple in Jerusalem.
Okay, but how do we know when Solomon ruled? We can't just count backward from today using the Bible alone. How do historians peg a concrete year to Solomon's 4th year?
That's where we use what historians call synchronisms. We look for moments where biblical history intersects with highly documented histories of neighboring empires.
Like the Assyrians.
Exactly. The Assyrians kept meticulous king lists, and they recorded specific astronomical events, like the Bursagal solar eclipse. Modern astronomers can pinpoint that eclipse to the exact day, June 15, 763 BC.
So they used the eclipse to anchor the Assyrian timeline to our modern calendar.
Precisely. And from there, historians cross-reference battles where Assyrian kings fought later biblical kings, like Ahab or Jehu. By chaining those overlaps backward year by year, they arrive at a consensus for the start of Solomon's reign.
And Solomon's 4th year lands at 966 BC.
Yes. 966 BC is the anchor.
So the math is incredibly straightforward. You take 966 BC, you add the 480 years from our kings to go backward in time, and you land dead on 1446 BC.
Which puts the Exodus squarely in the mid-15th century BC.
Right. And if that math holds up, who is the pharaoh on the throne in 1446?
During that specific window, it would have been either Thutmose III, often called the Napoleon of Egypt for his military campaigns, or his successor, Amenhotep II. Both fit the profile of a stubborn monarch refusing to let a labor force go.
It sounds so clean. You have an explicit number, you do the math, you find the pharaoh, case closed, right? But then we run headfirst into the second theory, the 13th century late date. And this doesn't rely on math. It relies on explicit geographic details from the book of Exodus itself.
This is where the physical dirt contradicts the math. If we look at Exodus 1.11, it describes the actual forced labor. It explicitly states that the Israelites built the store cities of Pithom and Ramses.
And that name, Ramses, is the absolute smoking gun.
It's a massive problem for the 15th century date. Modern archaeology has physically uncovered the ruins of this location in the Delta, the ancient capital of Ramses. And the record is crystal clear on who built it.
It wasn't Thutmose III.
No. It was a great 19th dynasty pharaoh, Ramses II.
Ramses the Great.
Yeah.
The guy with an ego so massive he slapped his name on monuments he didn't even build. But I mean, if Ramesses didn't exist until Ramses II built it, and Ramses II didn't reign until the 1200s BC, the Israelites couldn't have built it in 1446.
Exactly. Ramses II reigned roughly from 1279 to 1213 BC. Since the city was constructed during his reign, if the text says they built Ramses, the enslavement and the Exodus must have occurred during the 13th century, likely around 1270 to 1250 BC.
And as a quick pop culture aside, this is exactly why nearly all modern media, like the Ten Commandments or The Prince of Egypt, they always cast Ramses as Moses' rival. Hollywood completely bought into the 13th century geography theory.
They absolutely did.
But this leaves us with an agonizing historical tension. We have to choose between the explicit math of 1 Kings pointing to 1446 and the explicit geography of Exodus pointing to 1250. They are separated by 200 years. They cannot both be literally true. One of them has to be a red herring.
Which requires us to really analyze the intent of ancient scribes. How did they transmit texts over centuries? Let's tackle the geographic problem first. If the Exodus really happened in 1446 BC, why does the book mention a city that wouldn't be built for 2 centuries?
Is it possible it was a later editorial update? Like if I'm writing a historical novel about the American Revolution and I say George Washington marched through New York City, a pedantic historian might say, well, actually, the naming conventions were completely different back then. But I use New York City because I want my modern reader to instantly know the geography. I'm trading historical pedantry for contemporary clarity.
That phenomenon is called a scribal anachronism, or a geographic update, and it is incredibly common in ancient literature. Many historians argue that in 1446 BC, the Israelites did build a store city on that exact site.
Oh, but maybe it was called something else, like Avaris.
Exactly.
Oh.
But hundreds of years later, when scribes were copying the scrolls during the monarchy era, the site was globally famous as Ramesses. So the scribe just updated the forgotten name so their audience would recognize it.
So if that theory holds, the geographic clue is the red herring, and the 1446 BC math remains intact. Okay, I hear you, but doesn't that directly contradict the other side? What if we flip the board? What if the city name of Ramses is the accurate historical anchor, because you can't fake massive mud brick ruins? If the 13th century date is right, how on earth do you explain away a specific number like 480 years in 1 Kings? You can't just say the scribe's hand slipped.
You have to look at how ancient Near Eastern cultures engaged with numerology. We view numbers as literal, mathematically precise data points. If we say 480, we mean 480.
Right.
But ancient cultures frequently use numbers symbolically to convey meaning rather than exact chronology. In the biblical text, the number 40 is overwhelmingly symbolic.
Oh, yeah. It represents a period of testing or transition.
Exactly. It rained for 40 days and nights. Moses was on the mountain for 40 days. The Israelites wandered for 40 years. It represents a generation.
Wait, 480 is just 12 multiplied by 40.
Precisely. The author of 1 Kings may not have been providing an atomic clock countdown. They were making a theological statement. 12 perfect generations, 12 tribes, 12 eras of 40 years passed between the founding of the nation at the Exodus and the building of Solomon's temple.
Wow. So if the 480 is symbolic of 12 generations, what happens if we apply actual biological math to those generations?
Well, if a realistic biological generation back then is closer to 25 years, then 12 generations multiplied by 25 years is only 300 years. If you take Solomon's anchor date of 966 BC and add 300 realistic years, you land right around 1266 BC.
Which puts us smack in the middle of the reign of Ramses II, building the city of Ramesses.
Exactly.
My mind is legitimately blown right now. We are completely deadlocked. The math can be interpreted symbolically to perfectly support the 13th century geography, or the geography can be an update to perfectly support the 15th century math. We have two brilliant, utterly contradictory theories.
It's the ultimate archaeological puzzle.
To break this tie, we can't just keep rereading the same verses. We need an independent third-party witness, someone entirely outside the biblical tradition to weigh in.
And incredibly, the sands of Egypt yielded exactly that.
Yeah.
In 1896, in Thebes, archaeologists uncovered what is now considered the crown jewel of biblical archaeology.
Yes. The third visual source in our deep dive, the Merneptah Stele. Let's really analyze the historical value of this because it's massive. Imagine standing in the Cairo Museum today looking up at this thing.
It commands the room.
It's a towering, rounded slab of dark black granite over 10 feet tall. The top has this carved relief of the Egyptian god Amun handing a scimitar to the pharaoh. But beneath that artwork, the entire face of the stone is covered, edge to edge, in meticulously carved hieroglyphs. It's like an ancient billboard.
It was a monument to royal ego. It was erected in 1209 BC by Pharaoh Merneptah.
Who is the son of Ramses II.
Right. He inherited a massive empire, but also a lot of instability. This stele is a victory monument, boasting about a military campaign he led north into Canaan to violently suppress some rebellions.
It reads like a classic dictator's press release. Look at all the enemies I crushed. Look how invincible I am.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
But hidden inside this exhausting list of conquered city-states is something that fundamentally altered our understanding of history. Towards the very bottom of the stele, in the second-to-last line, there's a sequence of hieroglyphs that sent shockwaves through the community.
Because it is the very first historical extra-biblical mention of Israel ever found?
Exactly. The first time the name appears outside the Bible.
The translation provided in our source material is brutal, but poetic. It reads, Canaan is captive with all woe. Ashkelon is conquered, Gezer seized, Yenoam made non-existent. Israel is laid waste, his seed is not.
Merneptah claiming he wiped them off the map.
Right, which we know was an imperial exaggeration because Israel survived. But what is truly groundbreaking here isn't just that the name Israel is carved in stone. We have to compare the biblical record with the meaning of the specific hieroglyphics used on this stele. It's about that tiny, silent grammatical mechanism at the end of the word.
Right. To understand the true weight of this, we have to look at the structural mechanics of Middle Egyptian. Hieroglyphs are not just letters. When an ancient scribe spelled out a word phonetically, they would attach a specific symbol at the very end called a determinative.
I have to admit, I get lost when we talk about silent symbols. If a symbol isn't pronounced out loud, how does it add any meaning? Why even bother carving it into granite?
Because the Egyptian language had many homophones, words that sounded the same but meant different things. A determinative was a visual classifying tool. Its sole purpose was to tell the reader exactly what category of thing they were reading about.
Oh, like giving context.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For example, if you spelled out the phonetic sounds for a word that meant tree, you would put the determinative symbol for plant at the end. You didn't pronounce the plant symbol, but it instantly signaled to your brain, this word is a botanical term, not a piece of furniture.
Okay, so applied to geography on this stele. The scribe is listing off all these places Merneptah destroyed in Canaan. Ashkelon, Gezer, and Yenoam.
And those were all well-known, heavily fortified, established city-states. So when the scribe carved Ashkelon, Gezer, and Yenoam, he attached the determinative symbol for a settled city-state or foreign land.
What does that symbol look like?
Visually, it looks like a throwing stick placed next to a symbol of 3 hills or mountains. That determinative meant this specific enemy is a geographical location. It has borders, walls. It's a fixed state.
But when the chisel gets to the word Israel, the scribe changes the grammatical rules.
He swaps the symbol. Instead of using the throw stick and mountains to designate a city-state, the scribe attaches a completely different determinative to Israel. He carves the symbol of a man and a woman sitting down with 3 small vertical strokes underneath them.
And the strokes mean plural, right?
Yes. And this specific determinative is used to classify a nomadic people, or a foreign socioethnic group without fixed borders.
Wait, you're telling me a scribe just happened to use a different symbol? Couldn't it just be a typo, like a lazy chisel strike by an exhausted stonemason?
You would think so, but no. Ancient Egyptian scribes, especially those working on royal monumental propaganda carved into unforgiving granite, were meticulous.
Yeah.
Every symbol was vetted. The use of the socio-ethnic determinative was a deliberate, calculated statement about the political nature of the enemy.
This is a staggering revelation. It's not just a name check. It's a detailed sociological status update from the year 1209 BC.
That's a great way to put it.
The Egyptian Empire is officially going on the record to say, we fought this group of people called Israel and Canaan, but unlike Ashkelon, Israel doesn't have a capital city. They don't have walls or defined borders. They are a roaming, tribal, nomadic group.
Which creates an incredible synchronicity with the biblical narrative. According to the texts of Joshua and Judges, after the Israelites escaped Egypt and crossed into Canaan, they didn't instantly construct massive stone castles.
Right, they didn't have a unified monarchy yet.
Exactly. They were a loose confederation of tribes. They lived in tents and small, unwalled settlements. They were newly arriving and highly decentralized. So, the Merneptah Stele independently confirms that the cultural and geographical state of Israel in 1209 BC perfectly matches the biblical description of their earliest days in the land.
It's like finding a 3,000-year-old tax receipt. The receipt proves you were definitely living in the neighborhood in the year 1209 BC. But the specific tax code on the receipt, the determinative, shows that you hadn't built a permanent house yet. You were just camping on the property.
I love that analogy. It perfectly encapsulates the value of the stele. It's a high-resolution snapshot of a people in profound transition.
But we have to ask the critical question. How does this tax receipt break the deadlock between our 15th century and 13th century dating debate? Because that's what we've been trying to solve.
Well, if Israel's already established enough in Canaan by 1209 BC to be recognized as a distinct military threat by the Egyptian Empire, the exodus their escape from slavery must have happened before 1209 BC.
Because you can't be conquered in Canaan if you are still making mud bricks in Goshen.
Precisely. The stele acts as a hard ceiling, a terminus antiquem. The exodus could not have happened after 1209. Now, if you support the 13th century late date theory that the exodus happened under Ramses II around 1250 BC, the Merneptah Stele creates a very uncomfortable squeeze.
Oh, I see the math there. You only have about 40 years between the Israelites leaving Egypt and Merneptah showing up to fight them in Canaan.
Right. That is a radically tight window for an entire slave population to escape, wander the desert, cross the Jordan, and establish enough of a recognized socioethnic identity to be featured on a pharaoh's victory monument.
It's basically asking a group of refugees to become a recognized nation-state overnight. Which is why defenders of the 15th century early date look at the Merneptah Stele and take a massive victory lap.
They absolutely do. Because if the Exodus happened in 1446 BC, that gives the Israelites over 200 years to wander, settle in, establish their tribal territories, and become the significant demographic presence in Canaan that Merneptah boasts about wiping out.
So that tiny, silent, determinative symbol seems to tip the scales heavily toward the older math, the 15th century.
It certainly provides robust circumstantial support for a longer settlement period in Canaan. Though, as with all things in archaeology, the debate is far from over. Proponents of the 13th century date argue that 40 years is actually plenty of time for a nomadic group to make a name for themselves, especially if they were causing chaos in the highlands.
Yeah, but it's a tight 40 years.
It is tight. But the beauty of this field is that the Earth is always holding back more secrets. The next turn of the spade could unearth a new stele that completely reshuffles the deck again.
It is utterly exhausting, but absolutely thrilling. I mean, we have covered an immense amount of ground today on this deep dive.
We really have.
We started by looking at a colorful limestone mural of Asiatic migrants in patterned tunics, bringing their donkeys into the Nile Delta. And in doing so, we found a highly plausible historical home for the rise of Joseph during the Hyksos era.
And then we explored the brutal pendulum swing of geopolitics. We saw how the trauma of foreign occupation birthed the hyper-militaristic paranoia of the New Kingdom.
Turning a welcoming region into a brutal engine of enslavement.
Exactly. Perfectly captured in the terrifying stare of that colossal stone pharaoh.
Then we navigated a maddening 200-year debate over chronology, pitting the symbolic math of ancient generations against the physical mud bricks of Ramesses. And finally, we found our historical anchor in the most unlikely of places, a single, silent, grammatical hieroglyph carved onto a black granite slab by a boastful king.
It's a profound reminder that history is rarely, if ever, handed to us on a silver platter. It requires meticulous, often frustrating cross-referencing. You have to take the self-serving propaganda of ancient kings, the deeply theological texts of religious scribes, and the literal dirt and stone dug from the ground, and try to find the vanishing point where they all intersect.
And that is exactly why we do this. We don't want the sanitized textbook summary. We want the messy, complicated, deeply human reality of the past. But before we sign off, this journey through the mechanics of ancient memory leaves me with one final, kind of haunting thought.
Okay, let's hear it.
Something I really want you to mull over after we finish here. We just spent an hour proving that a single, silent hieroglyphic symbol, a tiny, almost imperceptible grammar mark indicating nomad rather than city, could completely validate the historical existence and cultural state of a people over 3,000 years ago.
Right.
If a chisel mark on a rock can carry that much weight for millennia, what tiny, easily overlooked digital details in our own modern records, like a line of code, a metadata tag, a deleted server log, will be the determinatives that define our entire era to archaeologists 3,000 years from now.
Wow. That is a staggering perspective. It really forces you to consider the permanence of our own seemingly ephemeral digital footprint. What are we carving into the granite of the cloud, you know?
Something to think about the next time you blindly click accept terms and conditions or drop a pin on a map. We are all leaving determinatives behind. Keep digging, keep questioning, and we will see you on the next deep dive.